You understand that some of you are here because of an interest in this specific subject, and there probably are a few of you here who have a more general interest in aviation and airplanes. If you have a desire to know a little bit more about the chapter or possibly get on our mailing list or distribution list for the, see how old I am, mailing list. It's an email list. There's a pen and a piece of paper over there next to the very last piece of pizza. And if you're interested in receiving our newsletter, if you would please put your name and email address on that. We'll see to it that the proper connections are made. Normally speaking, at our meetings, I start by asking any guest to stand up and tell us a little bit about yourself. But if I did that today, we wouldn't get to the program. So I'm assuming that we're going to pass on that. But let me assure you that each of you individually are very welcome. I'm pleased to see you. And I know this subject has a great deal of interest. We've had much more than the usual amount of interest in the press, and we have even at this moment. So thank you for coming, and I do hope you enjoy the program. I want to tell you a little bit about the chapter first, because this is our opportunity to be public. We are interested in airplanes, both experimental and non-experimental. We have a number of members who are building airplanes. We have many members who are pilots, but many members who are not and who are just interested in airplanes. We sponsor a scholarship, and it's a significant amount of money, and it's used for flight training. You need to be recommended by a member of the chapter, but if anybody has any questions, Albert is here, and I don't know, you want to say anything, or am I talking enough already?
No. So scholarship is online. Wes and I gave a talk to the high school students who the scholarship is for, and one of the things I learned is 5 high schools that are involved in this program, 5 area high schools. So the scholarship is open to these students from these different high schools. It's a $2,000 annual scholarship, which should get them about 15 hours or so of flight time.
The most likely to engage you all is that we have a couple of pancake breakfasts. 6-6, or is it 6-7? I think 6-7. Thank you. Is the next one coming up. It's here at the airport in the hangar, and you're all not only invited but really welcome to come and have a delicious breakfast and help fundraise for this chapter, which allows us to do the scholarship and encourage young people to be interested in aviation. It's a wonderful organization, and if this attendance is any example, we're really going in the right direction. So again, thank you for attending. Each month the program is developed by one of our members, and Dan back there is responsible for inviting tonight's speaker. And since I know you have a great deal of interest in the speaker, I'll introduce Dan. Come on up, Dan, and he will introduce the speaker, and we can get serious about hearing about drones.
Thanks, Larry. Yeah, this was my month, so I contacted Roger. Where's Roger? Oh, okay, he's not far. Okay. We lost our speaker tonight, so anyway, I've known Roger for a while, listened to a couple of his programs, and he worked real closely with an aunt of mine who happened to be the DeKalb County historian, Phyllis Kelly, if you ever heard of her. She did a lot of research. And anyway, so that's how I got to know Roger, and I knew a little bit about the drone. A friend of mine's mother worked in the plant, and she told us about it, so I knew a little bit about it. I know it's kind of a hidden secret here in DeKalb, but anyway, it's an interesting program, and wherever Roger is, I'll kind of turn it over to him. But
in the meantime,
anyway, oh, by the way, I want to thank Tom Cleveland. Where's Tom? The airport manager, for putting up with us. Or there you go. Thank Linda for getting the word out. So, and anyway, so without further ado, he's getting his coat off. He's getting ready.
He's stretching.
I just introduced you, Roger, so you're on. Thank you, Roger.
My mother will probably call me.
Hello, everybody.
Hello.
I hope I don't need a microphone. This is a pretty big crowd. Can everybody hear me okay? Okay, great. This is actually a pretty interesting story, and I actually stumbled across this story about almost 30 years ago. And my wife and I were driving around on a Sunday afternoon down in Waterman, and she dragged me into a garage sale, and I bought this for $5. And I picked it up, and I said, this is not a kid's toy. This is something significant. And it took me 8 years to identify it. This was actually a very top secret hush-hush thing during World War II. It was actually built, all the parts were built by Wurlitzer and a company called Interstate Aircraft from El Segundo, California, operated the assembly of the plane where General Electric is today. So, but once I found out the name for it, it's known as the Interstate TDR, and it's, the TDR stood for T and D stood for torpedo drone. R was just an arbitrary letter assigned to the Interstate company, like, you know, like a B-17 is Boeing. Somehow or another, R was assigned to Interstate. Interstate was an interesting company at the time. It was actually owned by E.L. Cord, the Cord, Auburn, Duesenberg families, and he was very interested in aviation. He owned Lycoming Engine. He owned several like mail routes and small airlines, which were consolidated into major airlines later. And he was able to secure basically a cost-plus contract with the United States Navy to build this airplane. See if I get my clicker here. So it was a true drone, radio-controlled drone. And at the time, it was very top secret because they had other things that were involved with it. This was one of the really early, and it's really hard to find a good picture, but I apologize for how fuzzy this is. This was known as the Kettering Bug. It wasn't very large, probably had a wingspan of about 8 feet. And there was a real early attempt in the early 30s, late 20s, early 30s for radio-controlled aircraft. The United States Navy was experimenting with them. You can see they modified a little seagoing biplane, launching it off of a ship. The United States Navy was very interested in this. In the mid-30s, about 1936, they were interested in it, but the British had already started a program. They were about 3 or 4 years working with radio-controlled aircraft in Britain. So the Navy brass sent some guys over there. They spent a couple weeks, and they came back and said, yes, we need to start the program. So this was the beginning of the program in 1936. What's interesting is, does anybody know why they're known as drones? Usually I can quiet the crowd pretty good on that one. Turns out the British had a code name for their project. It was known as Project Queen Bee. We're Americans. They have drones. So that's where the term came from. So this is all, they're inventing things as they go. So the United States Navy started building prototypes. This was known as the TDN, Naval Aircraft Factory, built this out east. And you can see it's a high wing configuration, where this is a low wing configuration here. But they were really working on trying to work out the radio control mechanisms, that kind of stuff. And once they were happy with what they were doing, they started working with engineers at Interstate to come up with a better design, and that's how they came up with the low wing. And being a radio-controlled aircraft, it's a lot like a glider. It's got big wings. But this plane actually, the Wurlitzer and Interstate built here in DeKalb had a 50-foot wingspan. It was a pretty good-sized bird. So another kind of interesting thing was, there was a guy named Reginald Denny in Hollywood. He was a movie star back in the 30s and 40s. And he had a shop in Hollywood that sold radio-controlled model planes. And at the beginning of the war, he actually built the first target drone. And this becomes more significant as we go on in the presentation. So the idea was that he'd build these drones and then they could use the anti-aircraft training, in the United States. I'm getting used to my new clicker here. Now, we had a gal that worked for him, and her name was Norma Jean Mortensen. And it turns out that some photographer came by to help promote his airplanes, and he said, well, get that girl over here, we'll take a picture of her with this. And he pretty much talked her in and said, you really are photogenic, you should have a career as a model. And she eventually changed her name to Marilyn Monroe. But she was working in the war effort on these target drones. So this is what Interstate Aircraft took over. This plant, this today is the General Electric plant, which unfortunately just closed recently. So this is actually the west side and the north side. And if a lot of you are aware, at the south end of this original plant is a huge aircraft hangar door. So if you haven't seen it, when you go over Peace Road, heading north, and you look at the south end, you'll see an aircraft hangar door. Summertime, they used to open it up a lot just to cool the plant down. This was actually known as Arlington Furniture. It was built around 1940. It was a brand new building when the war started. It was brought, actually, the city of DeKalb is actually involved in giving them incentives to come here and stuff. Had the largest assembly line in the world for manufacturing furniture. So if you get a chance, you come up here. This is actually the layout of the plant when they started assembling the TDRs. You can see that everything went down the middle, and they had a nice span so they could put a plane and build it. Then you have a completed plane at the south end. That's where the hangar door was. The United States Navy built our airport as the top secret airport to test this plane out. So they would wheel this out, go over the tracks, and they were here. The old hangar was right near Peace Road. A lot of you maybe remember the old hangar. I have some pictures of that too. Now this is, and once again, within the last several months, we've lost almost all of this. Some of the newer addition to the east side of the Wurlitzer complex. But this is the section that collapsed a year or two ago, and they've pretty much just taken everything down. It's almost all gone. It's a shame that some use for the building couldn't have happened. Remember I was talking about the target drones with Reginald Denny. So he came up with the concept of a target drone, the first one to produce them for gunnery practice, and Wurlitzer made them too. In fact, basically Wurlitzer made these in an effort at, it was such a top secret project, if anybody asked when he worked at the plant, what were you making? We were making target planes, and they'd show pictures of this in the paper and stuff like that. So everybody thought they were building these target planes. And it made sense because it was a piano factory and they were good with wood, and these are all wood. But that was just a cover story. But they made a lot of these. And these were towed, In fact, there's a guy came by the airport a year or so ago. He wrote a book. He actually flew the airplanes that towed these, and then they would shoot at the little target planes that he was towing. And the name of his book is "Do Not Shoot at the Red Plane." So this is the actual aircraft. One of the first versions was known as a TDR-1 and had light-combing engines. They were not very powerful, but you could see they're flat opposed engines. But this is actually some of the research I got from Regional History Center before they sent the entire collection to the Smithsonian. Luckily, I was working with somebody at Art Photo who was able to save some of these photos for me. So it really helped me out in my research. I even have lists of all the part numbers and names of all the parts and that kind of stuff. So this is an aerial shot. Now this is super top secret. So the only picture I had of this for like 25 years, you can see the tail of one inside the hangar in the shadows. And all of a sudden, there's a local historian, Phyllis Kelly, from the Joiner Room up in Sycamore. She sent these to me. Somebody donated some stuff. She sent me 4 photographs. And sure enough, so here's the old hangar, and then this runway is now a taxiway. Never did quite determine what this brick building was. It might have been there before, well, it probably was obviously there before the airport was built, because airport was built in 42. And then this is the interstate plant, right there. And it actually says, I think interstate aircraft right above the door. That's where the aircraft hangar door is. So here's a shot of a DC-3, probably came from Glenview. You know, they were probably getting stuff from Chicago, and they were bringing equipment and, you know, approving things. And this was one of their little cargo ships for that. But if you look in here, we think that might be a T-6 Texan that's in the hangar. And then these are the two tails of TDRs. So those are the only pictures I have locally of those. That actually, we knew they were here, but it was just so hush-hush. So yeah, here's interstate aircraft. There's the hangar door. You'll see if you go over the bridge, over the tracks, head north. And they actually had guard towers, a lot of lighting, barbed wire fences, security guards. This was a very secure area. And there's some of the guards. Didn't want to mess with them. So these are some of the engineers that worked for Interstate, and most of their offices were over where the GE plant is now. And what they're doing is they're actually laying out these little objects here known as ducts. And they were little weighted things, and they could put a little rod and bend it. So they were working up all the designs to make templates. And then they would send them over to Wurlitzer, and then they would make the templates, and they would sand and file and all that kind of stuff. It was all very precise. Now Wurlitzer was making musical instruments, and after Pearl Harbor, within a month or two, they got the contract with EAA to start building these things. So they totally got out of making musical instruments, pianos, accordions, organs, and totally retooled the entire plant just to build an airplane. So they made, this is one of their assembly jigs, they made over 250 major assembly jigs from scratch. You can see stuff like this with all this tube steel frames and stuff, and over 2,000 specialized tooling and things to build this aircraft. And they actually retooled the entire plant and set up Interstate to basically, in the GE building, to assemble it. And the Navy built the airport and hangar, and they were up to full production within 6 months of starting the contract. Try to do that today with OSHA and all the regulations and things like that. But that's one thing that really kind of compelled me on this story, that it's incredible what was done on the home front. All these little towns across the country did this kind of stuff. Schwinn in Chicago made all of the tube steel parts to hold the engines and the landing gear together. You know, they had special little fans to kind of cool down some of the electrical equipment. They were made by Oster up in Wisconsin. The Osterizer, you know. So it's just incredible what all these companies, they just did all of this stuff. There's another major assembly jig here. And then, you know, women at war. So there's a few good pictures of the gals working in the plant. This was interesting. One of the reasons I think many reasons Wurlitzer got the contract. They were very proficient with wood. They had 3 generations of very highly skilled craftsmen that worked with wood, bending wood, which is perfect for an airplane. But they also were kind of high tech. This is an RCA box here, but it's known as a high frequency glue drying system. And they could actually connect, you see these little metal pieces here, and they could actually wire that up to the high frequency gluing system and clamp and glue parts and have them cure and be ready to go within 10 minutes as opposed to clamping something for several hours or overnight. So this was an important thing so they could get a lot of really good production on repetitive parts. And here's another assembly here, and all these wires come right off, and all these little clamps all tied into the high frequency system. It's actually very similar to what we use today as microwave energy. In fact, one of the guys was telling me that they'd have dignitaries come through and do a tour of the plant. And they'd say, so-and-so needs a fluorescent bulb on the line. Can you just carry that along till we get there? And they'd walk them by this machine, and the light would actually light up up in his hand. And it's the high frequency microwave energy, you know. And it's still used in production today. It's no different. This was really groundbreaking stuff. I did a tour of the Marvin window plant. They had a whole section full of this equipment. And it was no different than what Wurlitzer was using, you know. So between RCA and General Electric, there was a lot of innovation going on right here in town. They also molded their own parts. These are molds for wingtips. This is a tail cone there. You know, they actually made molds for the canopy here. This was all molded right here on the plant. And what's interesting about this is when I have two complete ones, and then this is just a windshield for one. When you come up and look, I actually have a picture of one here. It was about 7 foot long. It was 3 pieces. You know, but it's nice to have artifacts like this because you flip them over, you can see what, you know, the craftsmanship that went into, you know, getting all of this stuff together. You know, all the little blocks and the way they bolted everything together. But it's always amazed me. Most times you see plastic that's 60, 70 years old, it's all cracked and yellow. I mean, they really had the resins figured out back then, you know. So it's incredible what they were able to produce for World War II that's still, has, you know, is really groundbreaking stuff there. So this is a model of the plane that an engineer made, and I took some pictures of it. He's the engineer that actually drew this drawing in 1943. And then he had drawings of the plane, he had little blueprints of the plane that he saved. So he actually made the model based on the drawings he had. He needed the drawings of the plane so he could lay out the plant for all of these stations. And he was from Milwaukee. He was an interesting guy. He had like 6 engineers that worked for him, and he moved his entire company to DeKalb to work on the engineering on this. And he actually signed off on this blueprint in 1943. And then in 1995, when I met him, he came up special, and he labeled, when you look at it, you can see there's like tape label. This is the one that he did for me. You know, motors, wings, all that kind of stuff. He labeled it and identified each station. Then he recertified the drawing in 1995. So yeah, he's really interesting people. So this is actually an R1, and you can see here, here's the canopy. So I have just the front section of it, the windshield for it. And so it's 50-foot wingspan, and these are the Lycoming engines. They weren't very powerful. They did an R2 where they had Franklin engines that were a little more powerful. But the model actually, oh, she's taking a picture.
Oh, go ahead.
But the model of it actually shows radial engines. They had the 450 horsepower radial engines on the R3s. But the production, we really geared up for the R1s. Those are the ones that went to war. So this is one, we think it was up in Glenview. So you can see the big engines on it here. And the canopy just flips up and gets in there. This was a famous photographer. His name was Rudy Arnold. And he's got like 10,000 images of aircraft. And it was all in the Smithsonian. And I don't know if you remember, there was a History Detectives did a story about a guy, Joe Hoig, near Virgil, found a propeller by a small land field, farm field, and he wanted them identified. So he showed them to me, and they were a different brand, but I actually found 2 of these propellers down in Jasper, Indiana, in a veneer factory. Exact same type. They're basically what they call automatic propellers, or automatic pitch propellers, but they were a different brand than he found. So the history detectives got together, and we were trying to identify this here, and we wanted to get a real picture of it, which was at the Smithsonian, but we couldn't get it because they were moving in and changing all the facilities when they did the show. But luckily the show actually went to a manufacturer that actually, through the numbers on there and through research, they actually found a company that built the one that Joe Hogue had, so they identified it as being part of the interstate program that would have been, the propellers would have, they were here, and that's why they ended up. So, after the war, a lot of people took, things home, That's why I have some of these canopies, Found one that was in a garage. The kids used to take it out, and then they'd pretend they were, they'd set it up, and they'd jump in and out and pretend they were flying and stuff like that. That's why some of these are scratched up, or, remember I told you, all I had was, evidence was a tail in the hangar in the shadows. Now here's a group of them next to the hangar, ready for shipment. Well, actually, these were ready for testing, and then they would deconstruct them and crate them and send them overseas. But they're just in beautiful shape. They're brand new. They're all lined up here. So that's so the old hangar was just right over, kind of by the corner. This was a little plot of land. That's where all these were. And that was another one I got from the joiner room. Phyllis Kelly sent this one to me. So for like years, I never really had a picture of a complete airplane in DeKalb. Now I got a bunch of them. It was kind of cool. And then here's some next group of pictures. There's 3 of them in flight, and you can see that the landmark is the coal and water servicing that concrete structure over the railroad tracks. It's just west of Peace Road, and you can see that. And so I think this was probably right to the west side of the plant, and they were taking pictures of these. So they would fly them around town to test them out. So here's one in the hangar, in front of the hangar. And this, you can see the larger nacelles, that's the R3 with the big 450 horsepower engines on that. But they only made about 16 of those, maybe about 20 of the R2s. But they actually produced over 210 of the R1s. And, so they started this like, one was Pearl Harbor, December 42. So by 43, they had already built 200 airplanes. And they had to get going after 6 months. So it's pretty amazing. And what's kind of interesting is, it's a shame we lost the hangar, but what do? There's an object up here on the roof here. You might not be able to pick it out from where you're at. And basically what that is, that's this thing. This is about all that's left of that hangar, is this little piece here. It's actually quite heavy. It's solid bronze. And it's the tag on it from the Navy. And what they did was, that was positioned on the peak of that wing of the hangar, and it's got notations for heights on here, and then there's a little hole here. So a guy would go up on the roof, and at dusk or at night, there was a searchlight out across the taxiway at a predetermined distance. They would shine that straight up, and then he would just take this and he'd sight on where it hit the cloud, and he'd say, well, that's 1,700 feet, or 700 feet, or whatever. So all the graduations are right here. So I've talked with Tom quite a bit. We'd like to try and reinterpret this. I think the kids would have a lot of fun with it on site. So now a big thing for war production is if they really did a great job, they made a big deal of it. There was an Army-Navy E award, and everybody got a pin. So Tom Courtney gave me one of his that his dad got. His dad operated a war production plant during the war. And everybody got a little lapel pin. This was a big deal because they filled the Egyptian theater for the ceremony, and everybody came up. There was over 1,500 people that worked on this project at its peak, right here in town. Now, once I found the name of the plane, I knew it was built here. I started doing research on it, and everybody said, well, that never flew in the war. Well, I started saying stuff to National Archives, Naval Archives. I started getting stuff back, and indeed, the United States Navy did operate it, and they did a lot of training with it. And this was actually a fellow, James Hall. It's the first guy I contacted from the Navy squadron, and he had written a book about it, and he called it American Kamikaze. So you can see here, it's actually a drone, and there's a 2,000-pound bomb cradled to the bottom, and the canopy's gone. They put a flat fairing on it. So it was taken off radio-controlled and then flown to the target and blew up the target. So the entire plane was a guided missile. In fact, remember they coined the term drone? That's where the term guided missile came from Captain Jones and Admiral Farney that were building this airplane at the Naval Aircraft Factory. So that's their insignia. They're known as STAG-1 SAT-4. It's Strategic Air Group 1. I can't remember the SAT-4. I should sometimes I forget stuff. But anyway, it's kind of, delivering, a bomb. But if you remember Stag 1, you can go online. The guys that flew this actually put together a website about 15 years ago. And the one guy that started it up, his daughter has taken it over. He passed away, unfortunately. But if you go to Stag1, STAGONE.org, you can even do it right now on your cell phones. They got a wealth of information. They actually have the program from the History Detectives, a link to that, so you can actually watch that. Jeffrey Chown here at the university with his students did a documentary, like a 20-minute thing. It's called From Pianos to Planes. And he did a really nice job. I gave him a lot of my material, the guys that worked with his students and stuff. They did a nice job there. A lot of photographs, and there's a really good article by a guy named Nick Sparks, he's a documentary producer in California, but he wrote a really in-depth article about the drone program from 1936 up into the 60s. There's quite a bit about the Wurlitzer plane in that. So that's a good link there. So the United States Navy took possession of these. They were accepted by the Navy, and Wurlitzer would crate them up, and they were shipped to San Diego, and put on Jeep carriers, and sent over. There's a Jeep, some freighters and things like that. This is actually a little field in the Russell Islands group. It's on Bonega Island. It was known as Sunlight Field. This field was built expressly for testing out this airplane. Now the whole idea was, it was not near the theater of war, but they had it set up so that literally they could have a pilot. That's why it had a cockpit assembly. A pilot could ferry this plane 600 miles to wherever they needed it. Okay, and then once it got there, they would set it up in the radio control functioning, and they could actually take it off from a dead stop and fly it right to the target. So this is the inside cockpit of it, and the radio control gear that the mother plane had is actually in this drone. So when they were testing these out and proving these out, they had a pilot sitting in the plane, and he just sat there. And the radio control guy on the ground would take it off, then a TBM Avenger would assume control. And in fact, Commander Jones, he was telling me about this one time. He says, yeah, we had a guy in the basement of a TBM Avenger. And I've never heard of a basement in an airplane, but that's got to be a Navy thing. But you can see here, it's kind of interesting. There's like a little stick and stuff like that. But you know how the kids have the remote controlled cars, they go all over the place with joystick? They didn't have that. I mean, so they were kind of ahead of themselves on stuff. If you look here, it's a rotary telephone dial. Okay, so now they're talking about controlling drones from your cell phone in Afghanistan, and you could be in Peoria. Okay, they were using phone equipment to run the first drones during World War II. So they could dial in a series of numbers, and I think one of them told me like number 11 is once it was airborne, they dialed number 11, they would drop the landing gear off of it. So it gave them a little more speed, and it had a 2,000-pound bomb attached to it. They weren't going to try and land it on an aircraft carrier on a land field, there was some film where they actually did a test film, and the second drone that they ramped it up, and it started to go off, and the front landing gear fell off, and it went down nose. And of course, the bomb was like this far from the ground. Luckily, it didn't blow up. So, now some of these pictures are kind of fuzzy because, well, it's the theater of war. But if you look at the apparatus and sticking out of the nose of this plane, this is what made it so top secret. That's actually a television camera that would transmit a television image to the basement of a TBM Avenger, and the guy would be sitting down there with a TV set and his feet up on and off, watching TV. And he could control it with the radio control gear, the rotary telephone dial, and he'd have a hazy television image. It was about so big, and wherever that plane was headed, he could see the island ahead. He could go for it. What's interesting is I actually interviewed a guy who developed this camera system for this plane. He said in 1937, it weighed 600 pounds. And it was, you know, it was just too, because of all the equipment to get the television camera to work and transmit. He said by 1940, says, me and my guys got it down to 90 pounds. And this plane was actually built around a 90-pound television system. So everything was designed. So it's a thin fuselage, big wings. All that was just to house this television camera. That was the most important part of it, and the most secret. So here's some of that's a TBM Avenger behind him in the background. And there's some of the pilots. And actually this one here, that's actually, I met him. I went to several of the reunions when I was researching this. And his name was B.J. Thomas. You know, I don't think he was a singer. Great guy though. They're really interesting guys. And, you know, some guys palling around. But this is, a lot of people that I've talked to that worked at the plant, it's, well, that never flew in the war. So I would show them pictures like this. There's palm trees in the background, you know. That's not Malta. So this was the most descriptive photograph I've ever found, and probably one of the most secret in its time. You can see these guys here. They have these special little hand cranks, and they cradle a 2,000-pound bomb. And this is actually on Sterling Island, is where they were operating when this was going off. You can see this kind of spindly gear. It was designed to just totally drop off. Here's a good shot of the camera. You can see the lens there. And then there's a guy on top. They've already taken the canopy off, put it off the side. They have a flat fairing they put on. So once it was airborne, it'd be a little more aerodynamic. And then also, when the landing gear was off, that would give them a little less weight. But still, it was designed, it's a 50-foot wingspan, twin-engine plane designed to carry a 2,000-pound bomb. So, and toward the end, if you want to stay later or something like that, I actually have a War Department film of this actually flying a test mission at Cape Esperance in Guadalcanal. We had already, by 1944, when they were operating this, they needed to prove to the high admirals and all these guys that this would work. So they took 4 drones controlled by 2 TBM Avengers and flew a test mission against a beached Japanese freighter that the Japanese, it was beached when they were there. They had anti-aircraft platforms on this old freighter. We had control of the item. So it was a ship that was grounded near the shore. So they actually flew 4 of these drones at it. And one of them missed the bridge by 3 feet and flew in and took out a bunch of jungle. Another one hit toward the stern of the ship, was a direct hit. They went for the bow of the ship, and the wing hit the bow of the ship, and it skipped into the jungle, and the bomb didn't detonate. And then the 4th one, they just went right midships underneath the bridge and had a direct hit. So, and this was all, and that was after they had, they'd only been in the South Pacific for 2 months trying to test out all this gear. They had all kinds of trouble with humidity and moisture, with electrical systems. They had a lot of trouble with radio frequencies being interfered with by other airplane traffic, and they had to sort all of this stuff out. But they actually showed them it was viable. But then the Navy kind of, it's kind of Buck Rogers weapon systems, and we got kind of air supremacy. They weren't too enthused with it. Luckily, the United States Marine Corps basically said, we could use that. So they operated with the Marines. At Sterling Island, they would take off, and they went after Bougainville, live Japanese targets at Bougainville and Green Island. So they actually flew about 30 planes, and I think 22 of them hit their targets. Now with the camera system, the TBM Avenger could be 6 miles out anywhere on the compass. So the Japanese had no idea where the mother plane was. And a lot of them didn't even realize it was remotely controlled. So they could literally, their accuracy was pretty good. But there's actually, I also have War Department film of this actually hitting live Japanese targets, anti-aircraft guns, and in Popering Island, and near Bougainville and stuff. So there's the TBM Avenger, and the guy's in the basement, and then when they got airborne, they would drop this little cone here. And so some of the radio and television signals were received with equipment that was housed in there. And then here's actually an R1 with its bomb going to a target. So this is some. I was telling you about the test. This is the Japanese freighter, a beach freighter. I think it was called the Yamaruzi Maru or something like that. But this was some shots. There's the direct hit midships. This is the one. You can see the drone is here, and it just flew right over the bridge, missed it by 3 feet, took out the jungle. And these are actually some of the images from the television monitor in the plane. You can see like little tributaries, and there's a river there. There's a small island. And what's interesting is when I was interviewing the RCA technician that developed this, his name was Jack Burrell, and he said, and on the video you can see it, there's little hash marks in the corner. And what he did was he put a translucent compass in the field of vision of the camera, because it dawned on him if they found an island, they could fly over and find a target and then come about and go for the target. But if they didn't have a compass, it was very difficult. So it was like a heads-up display that he put into this. This engineer was a pretty clever guy. He said it worked really well. And they actually used it like reconnaissance. They could come about and fly over, and then they go over to the target. But Jack Burrell was very interesting. I met him down in Texas. He was 92 years old. This was 20 years ago. And he actually worked at RCA, was working on all those guys in early television. He worked, he was working with when they presented it to the World's Fair in the 30s. But he came in and he had a bag, and reached down on the bag, he took an Emmy and he put it down on the table. And I said, "Where did you get that?" So he told me once, he says, "I got that in 1964 for work I did in 1944. I couldn't tell anybody how I did it till 1974. So basically what he did was he took the camera system he developed for this, and it was more advanced and smaller, and basically used that and put it on a golf cart and ran it up and down the sidelines of a football field. So that was the beginning of that kind of coverage for football games. He won an Emmy for that. But he couldn't tell anybody how he did it till it was 30 years, if it's top secret, from 44 to 74, So I've got some really interesting characters. Now this was actually the fourth variant, and this is really interesting. This was built as a prototype, and it's based on a Jack Northrop designed flying wing. I think it was the I-9N, and it was very interesting because in wartime, the United States Navy told Jack Northrop that you have to give E.L. Cord plans for your flying wing. He wasn't real happy about that. And initially he sent a combination of two different plans so they couldn't build it. And then they found out about it and they got the right stuff. But this was interesting. This had a smaller bomb payload because it went within the fuselage. We think it was maybe 1,000 pounds. It could be ferried, okay, but it was also television guided. There's the lens on the nose. And actually, it was designed to house two Westinghouse jet engines. So, and this is 1944, the end of 1944. Within 2 or 3 years, they went from this high-winged crude plane at Naval Aircraft Factory, and they had a prototype, and they actually took this up as a glider to test out the control system. So it actually flew as a glider. But back then, anything that experimental never would have gotten jet engine. It was hard to get a jet engine for anything at that point. So you can see, and these are just crude early Photoshop. They never took pictures of with the engine flying. They just mocked these up. But Gus Brigleb actually told me that this thing actually did fly as a glider. He was actually supposed to fly it, but then he got sent back to DeKalb. Another guy got to fly it. So this is the last remaining TDR-1. It's in Pensacola, Florida, the Navy Air Base. It's hanging up in the rafters. I was just talking with Mary, her dad, Al Roche. was actually there because he actually worked at the Wurlitzer plant, and he also was part of the Stag-1 group out in Oklahoma when they were testing the plane out and stuff like that. So I met him. He was from DeKalb. The first time I met him was, I think, at a reunion in Boston or something with these guys. But this, before they hung it up, and it was actually outside for a while. So there's a really good picture of Al with the guys in front of the plane, you know. So that's pretty much it. So if you got any questions, I'd be glad to, you know, really answer.
Did they ever use it just as a bomber? It did not have to be destroyed every time, did it?
No, it was truly a guided missile.
It just went to...
Yeah. Yeah, once it was airborne, you know, the landing gear was jettisoned. It wasn't coming back.
Okay.
Yeah. And they actually experimented it on carriers too.
Did they have any problems with the glue in making a wooden plane? I know that the Mosquito was a wooden plane, but the Germans, for some reason, as fancy as they were, didn't have a clue about making glue.
Mhm.
Did they have any problems?
Not really, because the problem with the Mosquito was it flew a lot.
Well,
They
I
put a
know
lot of
the
hours
Mosquito
on it.
was okay, but I mean, the Germans, for some reason, just had no clue about making glue.
Yeah.
And I was wanting to know, did we have any problems or?
No, I think the technology with resins,
Okay.
especially like on this clear plastic, Wurlitzer was really good for that. Let me pass this around. There's a lot here. Don't lose it. This is a product that Wurlitzer developed called Compress. Okay? And I counted it one time, I forget. It's like 20 pieces of plywood in like 1 inch. Okay, very thin, and they're all turned as they go. And the glues that they used were very good because they had that high frequency system. I think it was a lot better than the Germans had. And that's another reason that Wurlitzer was picked to build this. They were that good at stuff. Then they would take this with the high frequency drying system under high pressure. This thing might have been crushed a ½ inch. And, you know, this was actually, you can almost see a ghost of the Wurlitzer decal on there. It was like a paperweight they kind of gave out to dignitaries. But this they could actually turn like steel, you know, because they couldn't use the war essential materials. They just pass that around.
Roger, what was the speed on the aircraft with both the 450s and what size were the smaller engines?
I think the Lycoming on the R1s was maybe about 110, something like that. And the Franklins they might have been able to get 140 out of the Franklins. They were a little bigger. They were maybe more like 160 horse. But then the Pratt & Whitneys, you know, the 450s. I've actually had people in DeKalb tell me that's the first time they ever saw, you know, the jets go over the contrail, you know, the Weber. Okay? Since these were drones, they were practicing them above DeKalb at altitudes that normally you wouldn't be very comfortable on. And they were actually getting contrails around DeKalb in 1943. And then all of a sudden, you know, when the jet planes started coming, oh, we've seen those before. You know.
When they were flown here on the Cowboy, they always manned, or did they ever try and use the?
I think some of them for the high altitude stuff they did it, but probably pretty rare. You know, most of it was really up to the Navy personnel. But the Navy personnel was here. In fact, like I said, Al Roche was actually at the plant as Navy personnel. You know, working on it. Then we were talking about non-war essential materials. Remember the license plates? Yeah. And
Is that a soybean-based cardboard?
I think so. And I think the animals, the barnyard, they used to eat them. So, yeah. So, yeah, I found one of these at a sale not too long ago.
You talk about top secret camera and stuff like that. They make any provisions, making sure that it was destroyed when it was crashed or on a target, or they, I don't want the pictures to get out, but you can fly anything in there and leftover parts or whatever.
Yeah, if they did not detonate, they would have been banged up pretty good. Well, they would have been destroyed, but they wouldn't have been. A 2,000-pound bomb is pretty efficient for pulverizing everything here. But some of them did. I actually got an interesting call from a guy from New Zealand, and he actually found one of these R3s on Vanuatu, is an island in the South Pacific, and it crashed without detonating. So he actually found World Serve tags and stuff on it. And he contacted the city of DeKalb, and they had him call me. And it was really fascinating. You know, he says it was, you know, there was a lot left, but it was a pretty rough, you know, it was all cracked up, but, you know, but you could still see that it was an interesting airplane. The engines and everything were still there. So, yeah, he was an interesting guy. He goes on and says, you know anything about the Douglas Dauntless? I said, well, you know, just from what I see on TV and stuff. We found one of those on Vanuatu, and it actually had crew remains in it. You know, this was like 12, 14 years ago. And so it was interesting, because it said the natives on Vanuatu, the tribesmen and stuff like that, they did a special warrior ceremony for this remains, and then they interred them, and the United States government came in and brought them back to their families and stuff. So these little side stories get kind of interesting. Yeah.
Anybody do anything with it post-war? In other words, was there some kind of a need for, you know, aerial photography from heights?
Believe it or not, several of them were used in California for fighting fires, because they could lift a 2,000-pound wall. And they were kind of clumsy, but they did work. In fact, the one that's in Pensacola, very interesting, that one, I believe, was actually made in New Jersey. It was an American aircraft, actually built about a dozen, maybe 16 of them. But when we analyzed the, you know, people went down and gave me some pictures of the one in Pensacola that we have on the picture there, and they're actually World War parts. So we sent the parts to New Jersey and assembled some of them. So then it's not a true World War aircraft. But that one actually was like the Smithsonian had it in storage, and there's this little antique airfield in Blakesburg, Iowa, just across the border. It's a little, and they like interstate aircrafts. That's one of their focuses for their group. And somehow or another, the guy told me they found a Japanese zero engine. I don't know if that's true, but that is, you know, it's got to be super rare. And the Smithsonian said, we need that, we'll trade you. You like interstate, we'll send you an interstate from World War II. They thought they were getting one of these spotter planes. Well, they get all these crates coming, they start taking them apart. They got a twin engine bomber. They had no idea what it was. And they actually got a guy from DeKalb that actually went out to Iowa and helped them put it together because he worked on it during the war. And that's the one that, and they actually flew it. And it actually ended up at Pensacola. But there were, some of them had the end designation on the tails. I've seen some photographs of them. But you know, with the war, a lot of them went over to Sun Lake Field, and I did see one picture of barges with like, you know, a dozen tails sticking up, going out into the ocean to dump them. And you know, then there were supposed to be in San Diego, there were 17 of them in their crates like 10 years later, and somebody bought the warehouse, and they just took them all out and found the engines. They were Lycoming engines, took those out, and just took all the crates out on the runway and just ran them over with a bulldozer to cut them down. There was like 17. So, but out of 210 planes, you know, they expended, you know, at least 30 of them in the South Pacific, and then he had more there. But a lot of them, they were splashing in Traverse City, Michigan, you know, experimenting with over the lake, attacking small islands off of Traverse City, Michigan. And the guys thought that was really interesting. They were being shipped to the South Pacific, and they're training in the middle of winter up in Traverse City. Yeah.
Roger, did you say you were going to show that movie or not?
Yeah, I could run that if you want. I think I got it set up that will just take off. If I plug this in.
Roger, how many confirmed sinkings did it get?
Actually, most of them were land targets.
Oh, they were, okay.
Yeah. You know, being the Navy, a lot of the test was against Japanese shipping. But I have seen some film of a plane attacking a ship. Okay, so there's no sound, obviously. So this is actually the four drones going against the Japanese freighter Guadalcanal. And this is actually in color, which is really interesting. But I showed this to a lot of people. Yeah, see, that's when the nose is over. You see where the bomb is? Yeah. So they had some on reserve, so they were able to get 4 up and running for this mission, no problem. So they had a ground control on a truck, and once it was airborne, the TBM Avenger would pick it up and then guide it to the target. Now, these are not dizzy graphics. These are, you could see. Now toward the end, I've got some film of the highway the Navy plane, the highway, and it's like really fluttering around. Yes, way back there.
What was that, do you know what the range was for the operators to the, like how far they could
About
be
600 miles. About 600 miles is what they figured. So, so that way they could literally take it to an active area and set it up in there. Yeah. So that's a 2,000-pound bomb. Number 2. There's the drone. It's going for the bridge. Misses it by 3 feet. Goodbye jump. Now you see splashes way out here. They went over the ship. See a little mushroom cloud? Big number 3. This is going for the bow. And it literally hits the bow with a wing and kind of goes in. Now this next one's interesting. Watch the water right in this area here. I don't know if you can pick it out or not from there. Excuse me. So just watch. You see the splash?
Wow.
That's a pretty good distance where the cameraman was. Yes. Yeah.
Where's my helmet?
But as you can see, it's a true guided missile. Like the V-2 rockets, they were like ballistically like a cannon fire. They get them going at a certain angle, and the fuel would run out, and they'd land somewhere in London. I mean, here they're missing a bow or a bridge on a ship by 3 feet. So it doesn't show up real good. There's quite a bit of damage to the ship there. Yep. So that's what's left of the TDR after it falls apart. So this is the bomb that, when they tried to hit the bow, it just scooted into the jungle. I'm sure there is. There's
Safety off the bombs, was that remotely controlled?
actually, believe it or not, the Roadster was actually making proximity fuses at the same time. Yeah. So here's the camera equipment. And then the truck is actually the one that controlled the landing. So here's your rotary dial. There. So you can sort of see, they actually have a small monitor in some of the drones too. It's a bigger one in the TDR-1. Now these are actually live target attacks against Japanese targets. This is why it's actually considered a real warbird, because it actually destroyed enemy targets. They're going after anti-aircraft battery on Poperain Ridge and Balali Island. Like I say, these are not Disney graphics. That's Poperain Island. Poperain. So this is a television view as seen by the control pilot. So there's a shoreline. Now you can see here's the compass. You see it better on some of the other images. They're always in this corner. So like I say, set up a little translucent compass. See the tree line there? Now this is something you don't want to see too much. You get really close to trees, you don't like it. Those are real trees. 2,000-pound bomb turns off the camera. So it exploded in designated areas. This is second drone, and these are controlled by one mothership. They could, I think they, somebody said they could almost do 4 drones at a time, you know, but they could do 2 in, you know, in the event of. Yes, utility of photo reconnaissance and television of harbors. Approaches to beaches and ship disposition is shown in this film.
Did they actually dial a number to make it climb, turn left, turn right?
Yeah, well, there was a stick for some stuff. It might have done more for throttle or something. But I couldn't get anybody to really remember what the numbers did, you know, assigned to an assigned control surface function. Yeah, no targets located on first approach. Drone recircles and makes a second attack. And that was because of the compass. It's amazing when I show it to people that work on this plane, they have no idea how really cool this was. You know, it's like, you know, 50, 60 years later, I'm showing him this film, and they're like, we really did something, you know. They just did their work, and then they went on their way and did whatever when the war ended. And most of the drones that failed were from radio interference with other traffic in the area. But then they started reworking frequencies and got better persistency at it. So they flew around 30 missions against Japanese targets, and they're all set up. Here's a ship here. But they actually had an order for 500 more planes. And that's why there's quite a few canopies and stuff, because they were building a lot of parts. Yeah, boom. Now here's a drone that they were experimenting with hitting a beach target, but they missed the beach, they just hit the water.
Did the Japanese figure it out, or did they think they were kamikaze type planes?
See, there's an R3 there. I'm not so sure they, you know, actually, they were telling me they had film, I never saw it, they actually had film where like a bunch of Japanese were running across the field as they thought they were landing. Because they were lining up on the airfield to hit an aircraft gun. Yeah, so here's some experiments launching them off of ships. But the reason the Marines really wanted to use these in the South Pacific is because they had a lot of trouble taking out these guns in the sides of hills and sides of mountains that they would retract on rails back into the mountain. So they, like Iwo Jima, they hammered it with, they went after a little building there and hit it. In fact, my dad celebrated his 19th birthday on Iwo Jima. And when I showed him this film, he says, we could have used this because they hammered that island for like a long time, you know, but they were buried in, so these could have gone directly into the side of the hill and right into the tunnel. This is something else that they built. This was known as the Bat. And they would put one on each wing of like a B-24. You see it right there. And they would release it as a glider with a 1,000-pound bomb, and it would hone in on a radar signal. They were radar guided and hit a ship. And those were actually part of our arsenal until about 1956 or 57. The Navy maintained those. Now here's the TDN, the high wing. So you have to start out somewhere. have some pilots in here? It kind of folds up, doesn't it? But see, they've actually got a mocked-up bomb in it. Now, this is all at Naval Aircraft Factory. So that's why they needed like all these engineers from El Segundo. So I think they only built about 20 of those, but I don't think any of them survived. I think that was it. Yeah, it was about 16 minutes. But it's amazing how much stuff was actually documented with film back then and in color too.
Roger, thank you very much. If this is your first encounter with EAA Chapter 241, we meet generally either in the hangar or in the conference room upstairs, second Monday of every month. Programs vary very widely, but you're welcome. If you'd like to get on the distribution, you can find out what they are and attend a few that you like. Thanks for coming. We appreciate it.
Are you posting this on